We have invited the lovely Natalie Hughes and Connie Navarro to speak to us today about succession planning. So Natalie Hughes is a Townsville-based rural financial counsellor and she services northwest Queensland. She's been based on a small box property in Counselling, Queensland, and has worked across numerous farming enterprises, including cutting, silage, sugarcane, watermelons, pineapple, pumpkins, lychees, bananas, and has extensive knowledge of the conditions faced by family farming businesses. And she's particularly passionate about the social sustainability of agriculture. Connie is experienced Townsville-based legal advisor in the areas of commercial property and business law, compensation matters, state-owned land and resources, major projects and energy development. She's got more than 20 years of experience in the agribusiness space, and she's a regular supporter of and presenter at regional events. She's born and bred in North Queensland, and she's an advocate for regional development. In Northern Australia, she's the director of the Port of Townsville, former secretary of ITES, which is the Mount Isa Townsville Economic Zone, former member of the Townsville Industrial Development Group, advisor to key stakeholders in relation to lots of regional projects, and she's really well known for her authentic and relaxed communication approach to businesses. So today I'm going to hand the floor over and ask Nat first, what is the most important thing about succession?
Geez, if you're not in the deep end, what's the most important part?
I don't close to now.
Most, it's over here in the back row now. Wonderful. So, many people probably think the most important part is to maintain a relationship, make sure they don't pay the most amount of tax, to make sure that there's some transition before they leave the property. They're all really great things and they're all very, very important. But actually, the most important part is to communicate. That actually starts from birth, really. Succession seems to work on assumptions. There's a lot of assumptions all around. Whether the children actually want the business, whether the parents want to stay on the property, whether they actually like to buy a holiday home somewhere down the coast and shook off in their 50s. There's a whole lot of assumptions and not a lot of communication until somebody decides that something has to change. And often that's a bit too late, really. Here's my
Rest on your chin, that's okay.
See, I'm a musician. Well, singing competitions and actually like them. Some mics are going to hold me and some down here, so I'll try this way and see what works. It's George Bernard Shaw said words to the effect of biggest assumption is that communication has occurred. If you're having these conversations instead when children are young, set them away and say, well, the other children is here. Then there's at least an assumption based on the truth. The conversation will happen a lot earlier when somebody is incapable of now communicating. Somebody has to emerge and see one.
Excellent. Connie?
Not much of a mind person, so we'll see how this goes. Part of my experience around succession is for us to stop putting it in a box that we only talk about when we start talking succession. And it should actually be part of business planning, business enterprise planning. Where's your future of your business going? Just because it's a family business doesn't mean you treat it any differently to any other business decision that you're going to make. So I think the reason we talk about communication is to talk about making it a topic of discussion earlier when we're in our business planning. And that's, when you're deciding to buy another property, you have conversations about it. By the time some people get to succession, with the greatest of respect, if you're 80, it's getting very, very hard to achieve an outcome at that age. Likewise, if you're 20 and trying to get in and do things really, really quickly, that needs to be balanced out as well. So I think it has to just be part of the conversation early. And we need to take this thing where we're making the word succession. I don't even like the word succession. I think that's just something we make up to sound important. It's just your business. What do you want your business to be in the future? Is it a legacy that you want the property to stay in the family? And I'm going to tell you, I'll leave you with this for the rest of this conversation importantly. During drought, I talk about succession. And one person said to me, why would I talk about succession? All I'm leaving my kids is debt. So in the drought, no one wants to talk about succession. When things are tough, it's really hard to do. But succession still exists in the drought, just like when it's in a good time. We're talking about long-term businesses, highs and lows. So it takes time to decide when's the right time to take the steps in succession, but the planning can happen over an extended period of time. So let's not just treat it as the lawyer talked about it, the accountant, the bankers, there's some bankers here. Sometimes those bankers are the first person that actually talks about succession with customers because they see them quite regularly. Lawyers often on the end of the conversation, I was talking to my banker and they said we need to do something about succession, so I'm ringing you, what do we do next? I want to try and have that conversation more regularly, more frequently with people. And that's what your trusted advisor should be doing. So succession is just a continuous business discussion in my view.
And it's really hard to start that conversation. So how do I start it? What's my first place? I mean, I think you just kind of covered off on that a little bit. But
I think one of the things is if it's bringing kids as they're sort of getting into their 20s is education about what your business is. It's like, some people don't take them to see the bank manager, some people don't know what freehold land is versus leasehold land, don't know what debt levels are, what equity is. There's an education process to begin with to understand the business. So that means mum and dad having to allow the look-in from the next generation, but also the next generation being ready to have a look in and understand what's going on. So I think that takes a bit of time to allow that confidence on both sides of the fence to allow that to occur. Once that education is in there, the conversation can continue. So when there's discussion about buying another property, what's the acquisition for? What's the purpose of the acquisition? Why is it being done? And I think the conversation naturally can flow. But again, it's easy to say now, but if you're starting generation today with a family with kids in their 20s, it's probably easier than what it was 20 years ago. So it's about continuing the conversation, when the kids are old enough to understand, if they're showing a desire to be on the property, if there's a legacy that people want to keep the properties in the family. That's not always the case. I've seen plenty of successful plans which include a sale of assets and give everyone the opportunity to start something different. That's not wrong. It's an example of what worked for that family.
Pat, as a rural financial counsellor, is succession part of the planning of that business plan?
Well, absolutely, but I think we're probably remiss in skipping straight over reviewing the definition of succession too. Because we build succession up to be this big thing, like it's the transfer of the property, or all the other assets too, but the transfer of property. And that's actually not true at all. Because succession tends to be incremental. It might be by the time your kid's 25 years old, giving them responsibility for choosing the balls each year. It can be whether they are taking over putting the budget together. Who's doing the business every 3 months. It can be small transitional changes to that business until succession is no longer really a conversation so much as saying, you're capable of doing everything you've actually done evening out to enjoy my retirement. It's no longer this big thing that I need to approach, but anyway.
Sorry.
So I'd like you to put that next slide up in my hand. What everyone always asks is where do you actually start when we start turning your mind to succession? And I always say, let's just understand what we've got right now. Like the first thing is really know your business structure. Probably go around the room and ask who owns the land, and most people will say it's in my individual name. I said, what's your trading entity? a partnership, maybe I'll get some people say a company, some people throw out a trust, usually followed by, I'm not really sure what the trust does, but my accountant says I need to have a trust. And that's common. So I always say one of the important things with succession is understanding what you've got now, the different aspects of your business. Is it land, livestock, crops, water allocations, who owns what? If you haven't got a corporate diagram or structure or something, if you all have accountants, and usually they're the first ones that do it because I see you every year to do your tax, get a corporate diagram done. You know, this piece of land is owned by this entity, this company owns this cattle, who owns your plant and equipment, do you have a company that employs employees? People have got any number of different structures for a whole range of reasons. Start by knowing the structure. That's really important. Because when we start talking succession planning and people say, I'm just going to transfer the livestock from here to here, it's what entity is transferring the livestock. Because you understand as an individual, that's a legal entity, the company's a legal entity, and the trust's a legal entity. You might be the person that controls all three of those, but there's still different steps that have to be taken to transition asset from each of those. There's different capital gains tax consequences, there's different stamp duty treatment, there's different financing requirements when you go to the bank in terms of how do you restructure. So starting with an understanding of what you've got is really, really important. Quickly followed by the second one, which is what are the assets and what are the liabilities on those assets? What security is held? So as soon as you start carving out the assets, what happens with the debt? That's probably a question that often gets asked. Okay?
Yeah.
Did you want to continue through your... Has anyone got a question at this point in time?
This is really handy when it's interactive because people challenge us with all sorts of questions that are getting a hole in their guts, and it's really good to ask them. So happy to hear it. I have spent seminars where I spent so much time on the first one when people ask me about trust that they barely got to some of the next topics. So if there's something that you want to throw out to us, please do that. Otherwise, we'll go on to what's the legacy.
Connie, what's the difference between, say, a partnership and tenancy common?
Okay, so it's merging two different things that are unrelated. So a partnership is a partnership of individuals with a common goal to make a profit. Now, it can also be a partnership of companies. It doesn't have to be individuals. Now, a partnership, you normally nominate the shares in your partnership documents, which most people don't have a partnership agreement. So if that's the case, it's equal or thirds, depending on the number of partners. But that partnership is usually in relation to a trading entity. It can be in regards to a land ownership entity. The comment of tenants in common is in relation to land ownership. There are two ways in which they own land. Joint tenants, which is, let's say, husband and wife, when one passes away, the share goes to the survivor, automatically. It doesn't matter what the will says, because it's joint tenants. Tenants in common is different. It splits the asset in the shares equally, or 1/3, or 1/99. It varies, whatever percentage you like. But the tenants in common, when a party passes away, their share is not automatically going to the survivor. Their share has to be dealt with in their will. If they don't have a will, the laws of the intestacy. So I often have people come in to make wills, they swear black and blue it's joint tenants because that's the one they've heard. I go and do a search, it says tenants in common, 1/3, 2/3. So then we deal with that asset in the will as to who receives those shares. So understand your business includes understand the land tenure, understand who owns the land tenure, in what name. The second part is if that business partnership is trading on the land, does your accountant have the land as an asset of the business partnership? Because that can throw a bit of money waters in an estate dispute. If that land is solely being occupied by a business partnership, that might involve other people. Right? But just separate partnership, which is commonly in the business trading side, with joint tenants and tenants in common, which is mostly related to paying your own land. Thanks for the
Any other questions at this point? Confirming? Well, shall we move on to the legacy? Is that where we were at?
This is a big one. So I had an example once. I'd spent a lot of time with a family and they talked to me about one of their sons taking over one of the properties and continuing, because he'd always done that. And they said, oh, Connie, can you talk to all the kids and see what they want to do? So I sat down with him and had a conversation, and he said to me, and it took a bit of, relationship building for him to say it to me, was, I actually don't want to be on the continent. Dad's just got this in mind, I just want to take it over, and that's my path, my journey is set. And I don't want to upset him, I don't want to disappoint him, but I just want to go and get a trade and just have a trade. And he just didn't know how to tell his dad. So it was an interesting conversation after that. Dad wasn't disappointed by that comment, but they had this entire plan in their mind that the property was going to go to that son. But that son just said, I'd actually be much happier, set myself up in a business that's mine, doesn't have to be a property, because he wanted to trade in things, and he's very happy with that. Now, what happened to that land parcel? Well, with succession planning changed. It wasn't just about that land going to that son. There were other siblings, other children, that expressed a view as to whether they wanted to be on the land or not. But for some reason, they had it in their mind it was going to the other son. And he changed the mind on that one. So I think the legacy is actually having the conversations and understanding who wants to be on the land. Do they understand what that actually means? Because a lot of people see an asset and that's great. But it's your asset rich in cash poor when facing as well in livestock businesses or property businesses. So understanding who wants to be, what is the legacy and who wants to be part of it, is actually important. That's where that conversation piece has to come up. Just because mum and dad have got the perfect solution doesn't necessarily mean everyone else in the family thinks that's the solution. Nothing always happens. That's just not me.
We don't have a large property, but I just had this happen in my family. My mum and dad made my sister the decision maker. She can't even make a decision in a wet paper bag. She admits it fully, but no, because she was the eldest, that was what was going to happen. So how would you begin the conversations around, it's hard to have those conversations?
Probably leads to the next one. Please involve in the discussion. And this one becomes a touchy topic for many people. If I was to say, most of the times I hear from mum and dad first, and they tell me what they think succession is and how they see it going. And then there's usually that, we need to have a family meeting. Okay, who's going to be at the family meeting? And then I get a list of family members and their partners. I don't like this one. Oh, this one's okay. This one's just going to get in his ear. I said, righto, so I put it in your discussion. So sometimes it's family only. In a conversation, that's easy to say. Family is really, really hard, and some families just do not get on. Some daughter-in-laws and son-in-laws have the ability to rub people up the wrong way. So you have to judge the circumstance based on the family. I certainly have been in conversations where there's been screaming matches, so you have to separate parties. But the reality, that's not a fruitful succession meeting if people are at loggerheads like that. Okay, so getting it right is not always just a one meeting. It might be a gradual introduction of views. So allowing the siblings or the children to have a view first. If they want their partners involved, then there's another forum for that to occur. So I think it's an evolving conversation. But remember, if they're in a relationship that you influence, they can go home, have the conversation, and the next meeting is going to be a rehash of their partners expressed to them. So I'm not saying there's a right or wrong, and we have to judge the circumstance of it.
So probably a few steps further. Parents probably should have a really firm idea as an invention as to what they've actually got before they bring the children into the discussion. I've had many people come to me, they want to talk succession, and when they come to me, the expectation is that meeting is actually going to be to talk about division of the assets. Only for me to actually find that the debt is so severe, there's actually no chance of passing it on. They might have 5 children, a property that's worth 5 million, but they might accidentally have $3.5 million debt on it. It's too much for one child to borrow. Children don't get on necessarily, and as you said before, Connie, sometimes the best option is to just sell it. They need to know first, before they can sit children down at the table and offer them this potentially poisoned chalice. So it goes back to that communication too of, we're working on succession. as well, because if the child's not interested in that, what's the point, right? Put it on the market for the child. I also, aside from the family, will just briefly talk about your team around you. Lots of people believe that they need to go and find a succession planner. That scares me, mostly because a lot of the succession planners I've met, and they're no slight against the bankers, but sometimes they're an ex-banker and they feel really passionately about succession. Sometimes they're an accountant and they feel really passionately about tax. And sometimes, I met the one who's Liz Sykes the other day. Did anybody go to her presentation? Yeah, she's wonderful. She basically said she had no background at all in it. Her background was psych, but she was drawn to succession. She had to teach herself all the little aspects of it. No one person will suit. And I'll give you a really big story around that too. Clayton's brought their family succession plan to me the other day and said to me, "What do you think about this? My in-laws have just had a succession plan come out. This is a local property on the Gulf Cape sort of area. And this planner, they had two properties. One worth, one worth about 12 million and the other one worth about 7 million. Two children. Easily, the children would stay one on one property, one on the other. That was no problem. But this planner had worked out. They still had a debt that needed to be addressed. And the parents needed so much money to move away, buy a house or a small block of land somewhere else. That was all well and good, but this person was a former accountant. Had decided she should split the debt equally. So let's say that the total cost for the parents to move out was 8 million. They decided two children will split that 4 million each way. And that's well and good. But when the children don't have any assets themselves, person will be $12 million property. That's fine. That's only 30% debt for them. 33 for the big fussy. But for the other person, that was well over 50%. So no bank was remotely going to be and that debt loan is never going to be serviceable for that small property. So in that case, that one person didn't work to feel well. So I always say, you've already got an accountant you trust. You don't trust your accountant, get a new one because they're supposed to see you every year and help you. So, accountant. Then you get a solicitor. One who is actually interested in all aspects of your business, not just that moment in time. Perhaps you'll see somebody like me first, and for legal reasons, being Commonwealth funded, we're not allowed to do succession planning. What we're really amazing at is doing that assets and liabilities investigation. We're able to help you go through what debts are there, what assets are there. We're able to help you put that team together and might help you with the business planning side of things. We can even interview the children. We do not mean yet, I will say that right now, although that seems to keep accidentally happening to you. But we set it up. You might come and see me first. I don't know the taxation side because I don't do tax. I'm going to send you off to your accountant. Your accountant says, yep, this is a good method. We send you off to Connie. She says, well, yes or no. But if you've got a good team, you'll avoid an awful lot of problems that come with just having that one person.
I think everyone's got trusted advisors around them. Use them. You trust them, use them. That's the reality. If they're not experienced in the area, they'll refer you on to someone else. So from my point of view, I think a trusted advisor relationship you should have in business anyway, and you'll seek out the assistance. If you want to use a succession plan, there's a role. That's going to assist you with navigating communication, for example. Sometimes it assists with documenting agendas and minutes. People think they're going to do that, and they don't get around to it, but the succession planning advisor can assist you with that. They can assist you with a plan, i.e. start having regular monthly meetings over a 12-month period with the family where you can actually put on an agenda succession. So there are tools that everyone can adopt for those sorts of things. And I think that probably leads us into a bit of this, what people always ask me about is, I want to transfer my land to my son or daughter during lifetime. I said, okay. So we always have to weigh up, succession's not just about waiting until someone pops on who wants in their will. But there's a growing desire to transition assets during mum and dad's lifetime. And that can be achieved, but there's a couple of really big red flags straight up on transferring assets during lifetime. Capital gains tax and stamp duty. So there's some exemptions depending on size and scale of business. There are some exemptions in the stamp duty world depending on when and how we transition assets. If it goes from an individual to another individual in the family, a lineal descendant, there are stamp duty exemptions. The catch needs to be in business and primary production. I make that point because some people start transitioning cattle businesses away from mum and dad's control to children because that's the easy one to deal with. Often I talk about that. It's easy to do. But at the time mum and dad transfer the land to be able to access the stamp duty exemption, mum and dad still need to be in the business of primary production. Now that doesn't necessarily include companies or trusts. There's some curly stuff we can do to make sure that covers it. But if mum and dad have transferred all their cattle away and the kids are now operating it, are they still in the business of primary production when they're transferring the land? No. So you're not eligible for the stamp duty exemption. So when people start talking succession planning, the reason why I talk about it over an extended period is if someone rings me and says the first step in their succession plan is transitioning the cattle business to include the children and or double shuffle, if you've ever heard the word double shuffle from your accountant, to shuffle it to the next generation, and the land stays in mum and dad's name, and they don't have a primary production business, and if the next step in the future is to transition the land, there's a huge red flag. Stop. Let's have a think about this. We need to make sure we get that right if that's part of the plan. Otherwise, yes, everything can be fixed. You can have mum and dad go back into primary production business and you can transfer some cattle back to them and you can do an inch worth of documents to show the tax office that this is all a legitimate transaction. And you can go 12 months and you can tick all the boxes and do all of that. Geez, that gives everyone a go. And it's stressful. People want to do it by the 30th of June. The banks have to redraw documents because the partnership changed for the umpteenth time. So it takes time, which is why I think the conversation with your trusted advisor network, identify these red flags early enough to try and avoid that happening or to make some of the adjustments as you go along. So that's one of the challenges during lifetime is making sure it's not costing an arm and a leg to do the transfer. Capital gains tax is huge. I always get the accountants to run the scenario. There's a deemed sale value. I don't care if you're gifting your $20 million property to your son or daughter for $0. There's a deemed transfer value. It's the value of the property at the date of the disposal. Capital gains tax and stamp duty. So think about it.
If the parents are leasing the property to the children, does that keep them as primary producers or are they?
Not mum and dad,
They're gone.
they're early. Unless they have a third that remains on the property that's in their name.
Doesn't
Leasing.
matter how much, it's just as long as they are.
Yep.
Funny you bring that up.
Could you just repeat the question for the rest?
So the question was, what happens if the child then leases the property off the parents? Then my father's actually arranging that with me at the moment. I'm very lucky I can open child, which is great because my father went through the most disastrous situation at me, and that was done by will. He didn't know it was in the will. So he wants to do everything right, which is great for me, except he rang his accountant the other day and he called me afterwards and he said, Natalie, I've run my accountant and I wanted to discuss some other ideas that I had around with the way for operating because he'd like to start transitioning towards retirement. And he said, the accountant told me that the best thing I could do is die. I mean, technically the accountant's not wrong. Actually, it would be the simplest way. But obviously I would like that not to happen anytime soon. So we're starting to do long-term leases now. But obviously we're going to have to be based on leases.
So a leasing scenario may well work if the property is only going to be transferred on equity. Okay? So again, it comes down to is land inside the business at the moment, is the land intended to be transferred during the current owner's lifetime? If the answer in the plan is yes, then you want to be a little bit careful that we keep those things there for that to occur in whatever time frame. Okay? If the answer is no, that's not the desire because we're not eligible for the capital gains tax concessions that might be available. Well, the smart thing is that the asset doesn't transfer in ownership terms until death. But that then doesn't solve the problem when mum and dad are getting a bit older and, they can't keep running the property and kids want to have something of their own and be able to have some control. And this is a really, really smart solution because mum and dad, all the operating expenses of the land get shifted down to the tenant, for want of better words. The tenant can run their business, it's probably their business, it might be in conjunction with mum and dad, but that would have been one of the decisions in succession planning to go to the lease. Okay? If the next step is transfer of land, it's when. So that's why we talk about, and you know what, succession plans evolve. Sometimes it's a set and forget. If you roll it all out and the distributions occur, that might be a hit. But I've had people come to me and they've done a succession plan, 20 pages long. At the time, they all thought that was exactly what was going to happen. They took some steps towards it, and then they realised it didn't take into account this, and something else changed, and another thing changed. By the time they got to me, I said, I want to go through this, and you tell me what this succession plan is, what's still relevant. Aside from the names at the top, pretty much the rest of it, they said, has now become redundant. So they said, we're having another look at it. So we had another look at it, and we had a journey and a path of 5 years of what they wanted to achieve, and they had an end goal, and they had checkpoints every 12 months. Is this still relevant? Because clearly what they did once before wasn't relevant a couple of years down the track. So I wanted to make sure they didn't fall into the same trap. Sometimes one of the traps of succession planning keeps moving. It always keeps changing, and then no decision ever gets made. But they stuck at it. They had year 1, year 2, year 3, probably year 5. We had rolled the entire thing out. But the succession didn't stop. I asked them to keep doing their meetings after the fact to make sure that they'd achieved the goals that they wanted to achieve. And they did that, and they keep in touch regularly about it now. Even though they're all starting to go their separate paths. Mum and dad took the mentor role in a lot of those businesses. I think we undervalue that mentor wealth.
Connie, I think we had a question up the back. Did you explain what a double shop is?
That's a tax one. So a double shuffle is accountants access some rules under the tax law that allow cattle and or paid equipment to be shuffled from one entity to a jointly controlled entity or a partnership with 2 generations. And then the double shuffle is then shuffled out for a second time to the second generation. So you almost go from 1 generation to 2 generations to the second generation. That's a double shuffle, and it's done in a certain way to achieve tax advantages and to reduce capital gains tax as well.
Does debt pay capital gains as well?
Yeah, it does. But on death, we don't have a capital gains tax. Those who inherit, the cost base is set at the date of death. So for their purposes, so if at the date of death the property's worth $20 million and then they sell it 10 years later, at the date they acquired or inherited the property, that's their cost base for tax purposes going forward. There's no capital gains tax, there's no dead derivatives. You hear that shit get around all the time. There's no dead carries in Queensland at this point in time. Government does next.
Yeah, and something to consider, we've got multiple properties where they all bought for or above capital gains maybe. Sometimes people will do equal split one together. One just might be very property from pre-85, the other one post-85. One post-85, if they sell it, they're going to hit big time in capital gains. The other person, the other child doesn't. So in actual fact, what of their money split as they had intended.
Just this notice on the capital gains tax. I think on average, 1 every month, I get a query from usually an accountant asking me to do historical searches of how someone acquired or inherited a combination of both of the property. So that old story about know your business also means knowing the history, because I often get, this mum and dad went down to two sons and then one son bought out the other and they split. Okay. Do you all remember when all those activities and events occurred? Because apparently none of your accountants know. So they ring me, I have to do the searches, I'll find the searcher when the property was acquired and when mum and dad got it and when dad brought out the brother and then when it went to the sons and then when the sons changed the ownership. And you know what? I could probably write a story on some of them that is about 200 pages long as to how the property went from point A to point B.